us for another episode of Environmental Coffee House. Today is another State of the Planet address that we're going to be having. We'll be talking about the methane emissions and some of the Arctic whiplashing that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. We'll be talking about the synoptic heat waves that have ran across the North American continent, including where I live in North Carolina. We'll be talking about the hurricane that devastated Japan just 2.5 weeks ago, and also the nuclear catastrophe that will likely follow that weather event. We'll also be talking about superstorms hitting Yemen this week as well. So there's actually quite a bit to be talking about, as per usual, each of our states of the planet. But since Jennifer isn't here yet, I want to start the conversation off with nuclear facility safety, which is a project that I've been looking at very closely since May of this year. So as we all know, 2011, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant has suffered catastrophic failure, resulting in the meltdown of 3 of its reactors. Since that time, a lot of material has been collected in 3 by 3 meter cubic bags. And these bags were lifted off to, I should say taken off to a holding site. Hurricane Habeas came through and unleashed torrential rains upon much of the urban areas in Japan, including Fukushima. The agency is reporting, that's the nuclear regulatory agency over there in Japan, is reporting that only 6 bags of the 2,267 bags of radioactive material were recovered. So that means the vast majority of quantities of material are actually out in the environment now. I think what this should do for our audience and for people around the world is actually highlight the danger that's inherent with nuclear projects, is that once a nuclear catastrophe has begun, it's not a yearly issue or a decadal issue. It really is an issue that can go on for many, many decades, if not centuries. Of course, all of the nuclear disasters that we're dealing with recently are of late. The Chernobyl incident in the Ukraine in 1986, and of course Fukushima Daiichi in 2011. But as our climate warms, as weather extremes continue, we'll see that these already battered sites will continue to take on additional destruction and disruption to their containment efforts. And that's exactly what we've seen in Japan. What happened in Japan was declared as a state of emergency. There was, from my understanding, the death tolls were rather low, but millions of people actually were under evacuation orders in Japan due to the extreme amounts of rainfall that had occurred, which were actually unexpected. We're seeing a similar event happen in Yemen, actually, throughout this week, where a pretty sizable hurricane or typhoon in that area, cyclone, Category 4 on the U.S. scale, hit Yemen, which is a desert-like climate. So as you can imagine, the amount of rain that is terrorizing the Yemenis people is quite disastrous, especially since they have a civil war going on. And it's things like that that make me really think about the kind of feedback, the relationship that the breakdown of human society has. So a society like Yemen being bombarded right now in civil war and also fighting against, obviously, the Saudis. So you already have a desperate situation made much worse with these horrific hurricanes. But that is a feature that I think we should expect to continue to see as the ongoing climate crisis continues. That war and conflict are going to devastate societies, and then they'll be secondarily devastated by these catastrophic storms. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Yemen today. Elsewhere around the world, and we'll talk about all these topics a little bit more in detail, but I just want to give a quick overview. But elsewhere in the world, we're seeing methane story in Siberia is absolutely gut-wrenching. Arctic researchers are finding in some areas that these newly formed thaw ponds are venting anywhere between 12 to 16,000 parts per billion of emissions into the atmosphere. And just so you know, the background for methane emission or methane in the atmosphere is about 1865 parts per billion, so 1,865 parts per billion. So we're talking about something several orders greater than that, venting out in the thaw ponds. But the thaw ponds also have another effect. If you've ever tried to unthaw chicken or any type of meat, you would know that it will unthaw much more rapidly if it's sitting in a pool, or a bucket of water than if it was just exposed to the atmosphere. And that's exactly what's happening, is that the thaw ponds are acting as vehicles for rapid disintegration of permafrost integrity. So the entire cryosphere of the permafrost regions are changing more drastically because of these increased thaw ponds. And so we're likely to see huge amounts of methane excuse me, be continued to be released into the atmosphere from the permafrost regions as we go on. We're seeing these thaws happen year around, obviously. In the summer, what happens is that the thaw ponds are formed, and then in the winter time, the thaw ponds freeze over, but you start to see these beautiful pictures of frozen bubbles and water columns in these thaw ponds. But then once the summer comes, the ice sheet is thawed off, and those methane bubbles go straight into the atmosphere. And we're seeing this now increasingly year after year. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the 5 to 10 year outlook from now in terms of methane in the atmosphere over the Arctic region.
Well, what I've seen is it's not that promising. And it's kind of scary, actually. I mean, and I was reading of course, I'm not like you. I need a few notes here, but I was reading the article that you and I were talking about earlier. And that was the one where Similatov, they were talking about the numbers. He's the numbers guy. But the one article from the Washington Post was it just blew us away. And they're talking about Siberia. And I had to get this one in, was that the permafrost melting, the people's way of life changing, the climate refugees already from Siberia. And then we have deniers saying that nothing's happening. I think we should send them to Siberia. Don't you? Yeah.
Well, the infrastructure across the permafrost regions are buckling and falling apart. There are rapid changes in the structural integrity of the land that are causing almost like a wave-like effect in some instances across permafrost land. So a lot of people who live in the permafrost lands across Canada, the United States, Alaska, and the Siberian regions are finding themselves having to be increasingly relocated because of the ground itself is becoming unstable in those areas. And who knows how long that actually will go on for. In some places, the permafrost is actually quite deep. And so as warming persists and as new foreign water seeps into the land, we should continue to expect to see a type of expansion and contraction and buckling of the Earth's crust in those areas.
You know what else is going on? In Siberia, they have this whole new way of making money on petrified, animal tusks. And in Asia, they're buying them. It's a new thing up there. So as the permafrost melts, things that are becoming, coming up, tusks, they're making money on. And also, the people up there are living with the rotting smell. So as the permafrost just goes away, the stench of things that died so long ago is now permeating in the air, and these people are living with this. I mean, this is happening stuff. And I cannot understand how anybody can deny that this stuff is happening. It is unless they want to look at this and say, well, it's fake media and you haven't been there. It just astounds me. Astounds me.
You know, it's very interesting, but whatever publics might have in mind, or whatever even national parties say about the climate crises, militaries around the world are very aware that geography is changing, sea lanes are changing, and geopolitics is changing. One of the areas where geopolitics is changing most vividly is actually in the Arctic. We're seeing the Northwest Passage, the Fayville Northwest Passage, open up as we continue to see declines in Arctic sea ice extent and volume. That not even ice tankers now can go up there, but even just commercial cruise liners can go up there. And like you say, we do see that permanently frozen organic material is melting. I'm sure for the people who will go up north, there will be some secrets, some microbes that will be welcoming them, and so.
There's a question from Courtney Carini. Hi, Courtney. She says, do we have any estimates on what kind and how many diseases will be released by the permafrost? I was reading about that. I don't know if you do, but that's one of the things that was completely talked about, that there will be things, but it's not, nobody has a definite, okay, we will get the plague and 6 million people will die. It's not like that. It's absolutely not like that. Do you have anything to add on that? I was hoping Jennifer would be with us by now, but she's having some technical difficulties.
It's really hard to get an estimate of
see if I can find it.
Type of bacteria, of how many strands, how many different kinds, microbes that exist that could potentially pose a threat to human health and well-being.
Right.
The permafrost area itself is actually quite large. I mean, we're talking about a area that stretches literally tens of thousands of miles. So we're talking about, from Siberia across Alaska, across the Canadian archipelago. So no, there won't be any reliable estimates for the dangers that wait.
No, but you know what? It was mammoth tusks. I'm sorry, guys. I had to look at my notes. It was mammoth tusks, and it's just wild what's going on up there. It is just wild. And people, if it's not in my backyard, if I don't see it, it doesn't mean it's happening. And I'm sorry. I guess that it makes me, I'm just incredulous about it. Hey, Torstein. Torstein's with us. He says, hi, Tony. And let's see, Kim's with us. Maybe she said, hi, Torstein. We'll give everybody a shout out since we are. Hi, Chris Foster. How are you? Welcome this evening. And Karen's with us, and she's in California. She still has power. We're going to get there, too. We're going to talk about that, too. I just feeling really terrible that Jennifer is having technical difficulties. So, Karen, you said you still have electricity. Woo-woo. We're happy. I don't want anything bad to happen to you. But, all right. So we said hi to everybody that's here. And, okay, let me see. Tony?
Yeah.
Did you want to go on with what you were, since I interrupted you like I usually do, did you want to go on with your train of thought?
Well, I was just saying, with the permafrost region, I think that we should just expect the unexpected, because the permafrost region is going to be, or continue to be, the place that changes the most dynamically, the fastest, and that's going to have a lot of biological implications as well. It's not just about the cryospheric physics of the Arctic system, but it's also about how the biology responds, and not just, the multicellular biology like animals, but also the microbial biology as well. And actually, this is what we're seeing. It's a kind of a biospheric, cryospheric, atmospheric mix, where the warming atmosphere is melting the cryosphere, which is unthawing the frozen microbial biology that's releasing methane back into the atmosphere, which is accelerating processing. See, it's a feedback loop there. So I think we are moving, and we all kind of, back in 16 and 17, when we were talking about this, and 2020 seemed ever so far away, but just around the corner. 2020 is here. And as we move into this next decade, we will really start to see the impacts of accelerated warming on the Arctic, and the breakdown of the Arctic system as we know it, as it rushes back to its state. Well, we don't know exactly where it's rushing to, but it's rushing back. Our missions will detail that. Is the Arctic going back to a place it was 3 million years ago, 30 million years ago, 50 million years ago, 256 million years ago? We don't know. It just really depends ultimately on our emissions rate. One thing we should have in mind, though, is that particularly as the world gets closer to 1.5, 2 degrees and beyond, is that places like North America and Greenland are set to warm really, really, really fast and abruptly. Again, Dr. James White, this is a name that I mentioned before. He's the professor of paleoclimatology, and he's the head of the Alpine and Arctic Research Institute over there at Colorado Boulder. And one of the things that he studies is, huge climatic shifts over the North American and Greenland region. And from his studies, in worlds that face a lot less dramatic global climate change than the world we are entering into, we saw periods of where North America and Greenland had warmed 10 degrees Celsius on average within a college career, which is 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
So definitely as we start to hit toward 1.5, 2 degrees, we can expect that we're going to get some quite severe warming here in North America and Greenland.